Hey guys, tonight we're finding out why the most powerful man in ancient Egypt, a living god with a golden throne and a kingdom that worshipped the ground he walked on, may have had one of the most stressful jobs in the whole of human history. Before we wander off down the river together, one small favor, if these long, slow journeys into the past are something you genuinely enjoy, a like and a subscribe help this channel more than you'd think, but only if you truly mean it. And if the mood takes you, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It never stops being lovely to see how far these quiet stories travel. And that's all the housekeeping. The oil lamps are burning low in a palace beside the Nile, and somewhere deep inside it, in a room that smells of incense and fresh linen, a very important baby has just been born. To understand why that baby's life is about to become so complicated, it helps to picture the world he has arrived in. Egypt, more than 3,000 years ago, is a narrow ribbon of green running through an ocean of sand. Everything alive in it, every field of wheat and barley, every date palm, every fat brown cow standing in the shallows, depends on a single river. Each summer, the Nile swells and spills gently over its banks, and when it withdraws, it leaves behind a coat of dark, rich mud, and in that mud the whole country plants its future. The Egyptians built their entire calendar around this rhythm, a season of flooding, a season of growing, a season of harvest, around and around, reliable as breathing. When the flood came generously, there was bread and beer and singing in the fields. When it came weakly, there was worry and sometimes hunger. And the person officially responsible for making sure the flood arrived at all, responsible too, for the sun rising each morning, is the small person currently being swaddled in ceremonial linen by a committee of extremely careful priests. No pressure whatsoever. So imagine, just for the length of this story, that the baby is you. Here is the first thing to understand about your new position. A pharaoh is not merely a king. In the theology of Egypt, you are the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god of kingship, the living hinge between the gods and everyone else. Other newborns are allowed to simply be babies. They cry, they nap, they make a mess of things, and nobody reads meaning into any of it. Somewhere, a shaven-headed scribe with kohl around his eyes is already carving your freshly chosen names into stone. In time, you will carry 5 official names, among them one proclaiming you the son of the sun god Ra, each a small theological essay, and you will be grown before you ever manage. You are a political and religious event. Your birth is discussed in temples up and down the river. Omens are examined. The stars are consulted. To read them all in one sitting. From your very first breath, the people around you are anxious. Not because you are fragile exactly, but because you are sacred, and sacred things are a worrying thing to be in charge of. If you cough, the court physicians confer in low voices. If you cry through the night, someone wonders aloud whether the gods are displeased about something. You have been born into a job you cannot resign from, in a workplace you can never really leave, with a performance review scheduled to last for eternity. Childhood, in the ordinary sense of the word, is quietly cancelled. Where another child might chew contentedly on a wooden toy, you are handed miniature ceremonial objects that you are very much not supposed to chew on. Nobody sings you lullabies. Instead, hymns are composed in your honor and performed over your cradle by patient old priests who smell of frankincense and long service. Your nursery is beautiful and just slightly cold, all gilded surfaces and polished stone, with painted lotus flowers climbing the columns and a garden pool outside where the herons stand about looking wiser than your advisors. You are surrounded, day and night, by attendants whose entire job is to keep you alive, dignified, and pleasing to heaven. Even your crawling is observed with mild institutional alarm, as though the future lord of the two lands ought to have arrived already knowing how to walk. And before you can walk, the planning has begun. Advisors are sketching out your education, your public image, and, years ahead of schedule, the delicate question of whom you will one day marry. Above all, you are raised from the beginning to believe something remarkable, that you are divine. Not divine as a compliment, divine as a plain fact, taught to you as calmly as the alphabet. The sun rises, in part, because of what you are. Which is a rather lovely thing to tell a toddler, right up until the day the toddler understands that if the sun ever seemed to falter, or the river ever failed to rise, an entire kingdom would slowly turn its head and look at him. If you are imagining that a living God at least gets to skip his lessons, I'm afraid it is exactly the other way around. Your education would make a modern executive feel underworked. You are woken before dawn, while the priests in the temple are still chanting the sun up over the horizon, and a steward is waiting with the day's program in his hands. Nowhere on that program appears the word rest. First come the hieroglyphs. These are not a tidy little alphabet. They are hundreds upon hundreds of small pictures, owls and reeds, eyes and loaves of bread, coiled ropes and quietly seated figures, which combine, according to rules that take years to master, into everything from love poetry to tax law. Ordinary scribes trained for a decade and more to handle them, and you must learn what they learn, because one day documents bearing your name will move grain, water, soldiers and stone across an entire country. A careless sign in the wrong place is not merely a spelling mistake, it is policy. You must learn the names and stories of a very large family of gods, the correct gestures for every offering, which words are spoken aloud and which are only whispered, and the proper way to present bread, beer, and vegetables to beings who created the universe and nonetheless appreciate nicely. Egyptian geometry exists partly because the flood politely erases the field boundaries every single year, and someone must redraw them, and partly because this civilization has developed a lasting fondness for stacking millions of blocks of limestone into enormous shapes that must not, under any. Then comes religious instruction, which is a whole world of its own. Arranged cucumber. Mistakes are met not with shouting, but with the slow, sorrowful frown of a priest, which every student in history will confirm is somehow worse. There is mathematics too, and not for bookkeeping. Circumstances. Lean. By the time most pharaohs ruled, the Great Pyramids were already ancient history, older to them than they are distant from us. But the royal appetite for building never faded, and a king was expected to understand what he was commissioning and why the overseer of works kept aging so visibly. Add to this the art of public speaking, because your words will never be treated as merely words. When a living God remarks that the harvest looks promising, granaries take note. When he frowns at an unfortunate moment, rumour ripples outward like a stone dropped into still water. So, you practice speaking slowly, deliberately, ceremonially, saying exactly what you mean, and quite often rather less. And then, while you are still just a boy, military instruction begins. Formations, river crossings, the management of chariots, the geography of Nubia to the south, and the restless lands to the northeast. You have never once been in real danger, and yet you must learn to speak comfortably about campaigns, because a pharaoh, on temple walls at least, is always shown enormous, serene, and victorious, calmly holding an entire enemy army by the hair. Threaded through all of it runs the one idea that matters most, the concept the Egyptians called ma'at. Ma'at is order, truth, balance, the way the world is supposed to be, the river rising on time, honest waits in the marketplace, children fed, temples maintained, chaos held politely at the door. Maintaining Ma'at is your actual job description, and it is magnificently unlimited. A drought, a swarm of locusts, a corrupt official, one disappointing harvest. All of it, in the end, arrives on your desk, because the king stands at the exact point where heaven and earth meet, and the meeting point takes the blame. You will have help, of course. A vizier, a kind of chief minister, and beneath him an army of scribes counting every jar of grain in the country. But help is not the same thing as relief, because every official acts in your name, and the name takes the consequences. Your teachers, meanwhile, are never only teachers. Every tutor is also, gently and professionally, an informant. Your progress is reported. Your temperament is reported. Your questions, especially the interesting ones, are reported. By the end of a long day, your head is full of bird-shaped letters, sacred formulas and geometry, and you have absorbed one further lesson that nobody ever wrote down. You are always, always being watched. Which brings us to friendship, or at least the royal version of it. Other children have playmates. You have political variables in small linen tunics. The cheerful boy you race through the palace gardens is the son of the high priest. The one who keeps beating you at Senate, the beloved board game of the age, is a general's nephew. The girl you actually enjoy talking to was promised in marriage before she could talk, part of an arrangement that took months of careful negotiation. Everyone is kind to you. Everyone, without exception, always. And even a child eventually notices that unbroken kindness from people whose parents' careers depend on his mood is not quite the same thing as being liked. Privacy is not on offer either. If you slip away for a quarter of an hour, the palace tightens like a drumhead until you are found, because a divine child is never supposed to be unaccounted for, even for a moment. And favoritism, you learn, is genuinely dangerous. Invite one companion to play, and two other families feel the chill from across the courtyard. Say something warm to a noble's daughter, and by evening the corridors are murmuring about a future queen. So you acquire, very young, the skills that will define the rest of your life. The pleasant, meaningless laugh, the compliment that commits to nothing, the careful distribution of attention spread so evenly that no one can count themselves chosen or slighted. It is a lonely sort of arithmetic. You become very good at it. The strangeness only deepens as you grow, because the theology is never softened for your benefit. You are Horus on earth. The scrolls say so. The priests confirm it. Strangers press their foreheads to the ground as you pass. On the temple walls, you single-handedly uphold the order of the cosmos. At dinner, someone else quietly tastes your food and sips your wine before you do, unhurried and matter-of-fact, because a court is a place of ambitions, and it is considered wiser not to discover the hard way which ambitions. And yet you still stub your toe on the furniture. You still get spots on your chin, and a stomachache when you eat too many figs, and a head cold in the damp season. You are the most powerful being in the land, and you cannot take a walk without guards, attendants, and a small procession. There were daily observances and seasonal festivals, ceremonies for the rising of the river and for the sowing, processions in which you wore heavy crowns and a ceremonial false beard, and carried the crook and the flail. The shepherd's crook for guidance, the flail for plenty. while standing. Have curdled. Nobody remarks on it, it is simply one more ritual among many. And the rituals deserve their own moment, because a pharaoh's calendar was essentially a vast religious machine with a man living inside it. Extremely still in the heat. In certain rites you symbolically defeated chaos itself with props, and if you managed to reign for 30 years, you would be expected to run a ceremonial course at your jubilee, the said festival, to demonstrate before gods and spectators alike that the royal body still had vigour in it. Somewhere in all of this, presumably, there were days when you would gladly have traded a slice of eternity for one unobserved hour and a ripe pomegranate. But doubt could not be spoken. A king who wondered aloud whether he was really a god would not be opening a philosophical discussion, he would be opening a succession crisis. And there was always a cousin available who felt no doubt whatsoever. Then adolescence arrives, and with it the advisors, carrying scrolls and diplomatic smiles, because it is time to discuss your marriage. Here the customs of the royal house take a turn that sounds strange to modern ears, so it is best said plainly and briefly. In Egyptian myth, the gods married within their own family. Osiris and Isis were husband and wife as well as brother and sister, and the royal house, being officially divine, sometimes mirrored heaven by doing the same. A pharaoh might be wed to his half-sister or to another close relative, not out of anyone's affection, but as an instrument of theology and statecraft. It kept the sacred bloodline enclosed and simplified the politics of the court. To the priests, it was doctrine. To you it is one more duty announced rather than chosen. And that is all that needs saying, because to the Egyptians it was not a scandal but a formality. Dynastic administration, conducted with incense. What mattered far more to absolutely everyone was what the marriage was for, an heir. The moment the wedding banquet is cleared away, the entire kingdom becomes politely, relentlessly interested in the royal nursery. A pharaoh without a successor is a question mark hanging over the whole of Egypt, an open invitation to every ambitious uncle and whispering faction at court, and so the pressure begins early and never lets up. You are barely more than a boy, and already the stability of the two lands is understood to rest on the eventual existence of a smaller version of you. Through all of it, you must remain what you have been trained since the cradle to be, composed, ceremonial, serene. A living symbol of order and plenty, carved in stone from your best angle. Whatever you privately feel about any of it goes where all your feelings go, tucked behind the calm, coal-lined expression that the sculptors will be copying for the next 3,000 years. And then, at last, come the drums and the incense and the gathered priests, on the day your entire life has been aimed toward. The double crown. The white crown of Upper Egypt nested inside the red crown of Lower Egypt is lowered onto your head, and the temple proclaims what everyone has always told you that you were. The boy is gone. The god remains. You have finally been crowned pharaoh, and as we are about to discover, this is the moment your job stops being merely demanding and becomes something closer to cosmically impossible. And so the crown is yours. You might reasonably hope that the hardest part is now behind you, that from here on it is all honey cakes and gentle applause. Sadly, no. The hard part is only beginning, and it begins, of all places, with the wardrobe. Egyptian kingship was, among many other things, a costume that could never come off. Consider the false beard. Real beards were thought untidy on a king, for the ideal royal face was smooth and serene, and yet the gods themselves were imagined with beards, narrow, plaited, curling slightly at the tip. So the pharaoh wore an artificial one, a neat braided beard of woven fibre, fastened beneath the chin with cords that looped over the ears and, it is said, sometimes helped along with a little wax. Even Hatshepsut, the great queen who ruled Egypt as a king in her own right, wore one in her official images, because the beard never meant man. It meant God. Above the royal brow rose the uraeus, the rearing cobra of the goddess Wadjet, a glittering reminder that the king's attention was not a comfortable place to stand. And above that came the crowns, in the plural, because Egypt was never quite one country in its own imagination. There was the red crown of Lower Egypt, the marshy northern delta, where the river frayed into 100 green channels, a flat-bottomed shape with a tall spur at the back and a slender coil curling forward. There was the white crown of Upper Egypt, the long river valley of the south, tall and smooth and rounded at the top, rather like a very solemn vase. And when the occasion demanded, the king wore both at once, the white nested inside the red, the famous double crown, which announced, without a word being spoken, that the two lands were one land because he, personally, was holding them together. Here is a small and pleasing mystery. Not a single one of these crowns has ever been found. Not one in all the centuries of digging. Scholars suspect they were made of perishable things, leather and stiffened linen and reed, passed perhaps from reign to reign until time quietly ate them. So the most famous headwear in history survives only in carvings and paintings, and nobody now alive knows exactly how heavy the double crown was. The men who stood beneath it all afternoon could, one suspects, have told us precisely. The rest of the outfit offered no relief. A kilt of fine pleated linen, bright as the noon haze. A broad collar of gold and carnelian and blue faience laid across the shoulders, magnificent from a distance and, up close, a warm weight on the collarbones. For certain rites, a leopard skin draped over one shoulder, borrowed from the costume of the priesthood. In the hands, the crook and the flail, crossed over the chest, the shepherd's crook because the king was meant to guide his people gently, and the flail, the tool that threshed grain because he was meant to feed them. On the feet, sandals of papyrus and palm fibre, elegant, ceremonial, and entirely without sympathy for the human arch. On the soles of some royal sandals, artists painted the traditional enemies of Egypt, so that with every step he trampled chaos underfoot, a lovely piece of theology that can have done nothing for his stride. And none of it, not one thread, was a matter of taste. Every colour carried meaning. Every emblem answered to a god. A king dressed the way a priest performs a rite, carefully, symbolically, with no room for improvisation, because the wrong feather on the wrong festival could ripple outward through the court as an omen. And once dressed, he stood, sometimes for hours, under the Egyptian sun, radiating calm divinity while the linen clung. The gold grew warm, and something, somewhere beneath all those sacred layers, always itched. Because here is the central bargain of the whole arrangement, the fine print beneath all that glory. Unlimited power came bundled with unlimited responsibility. The pharaoh was not merely a head of state. He was understood to be the hinge of the cosmos, the one human being through whom divine order flowed into the world. The Egyptians had a beautiful word for that order, ma'at, which meant truth and balance and rightness all at once, the way things ought to be. When the universe behaved itself, that was the king quietly doing his job. When the universe misbehaved, there was really only one person everyone could think to look at. The Nile made this bargain especially delicate. Egypt lived by the flood. Every summer the river rose, swollen by rains falling far away in highlands no Egyptian had ever seen, and spread out over the fields in a slow, warm brown sheet, leaving behind the rich black silt that made the whole country possible. A good flood meant grain and beer and full storehouses and a contented winter. A flood that came too low meant hunger creeping up the valley. A flood too high drowned the fields and dissolved whole villages of mud brick. Officials tracked the rise on stone stairways called nilometers, reading the river the way a physician reads a pulse. And when the reading was bad, nobody blamed distant rains because nobody knew about distant rains. They looked, gently, unanimously, and with great theological confidence, toward the palace. Nor did the accountability stop at the river. A sickness among the cattle, a swarm of locusts, a strange light in the sky, a calf born odd, all of it could be read as commentary on the king's standing with the gods. Even his inner life belonged, in a sense, to the state. Dreams mattered in Egypt. There were learned men whose training included their interpretation, and a king's uneasy night could have scholars murmuring over papyri by morning, weighing whether the royal subconscious had received a message that required, say, a new shrine. And the one sentence the living God could never say was the most honest one available: I do not know. Ignorance was simply not on the menu. Whatever happened, he had to respond as though he had expected it, commission the proper ritual, endow the proper offering, restore the balance, and look serenely untroubled while doing so. It was never enough to rule the country. He had to be seen, every single day, to be holding up the sky with both hands already full of scepters. Which brings us to the mornings. The king's day began before the sun's did, in the dark hour when the palace corridors still held the night's cool and mist lay along the river. Attendants woke him, and the first order of business was purity, washing in cool water, rinsing the mouth with natron, the same salt used to purify the temples, for the king was cleansed like a sacred vessel, which is precisely what everyone understood him to be. Then came the dressing, which was less like getting dressed and more like being assembled, layer by symbolic layer, by servants whose entire careers consisted of the king's appearance. And then, the temple. In theory, and Egyptian theology was nothing if not ambitious in its theory, the Pharaoh was the high priest of every god in every temple in the land, and the daily service in each one of them properly belonged to him. Since there were hundreds of temples and only one king, priests stood in for him nearly everywhere, performing each dawn's rites in his name. But the theory mattered enormously, and in the great sanctuaries, on the great days, he served in person. The morning liturgy was intimate and strangely tender. The doors of the innermost shrine were unsealed and opened upon the god's golden image, standing in the darkness where it had spent the night. The image was greeted with soft hymns, as though being gently woken. It was cleansed, anointed with fine oils, dressed in fresh linen, and presented with food and wine and incense, a divine breakfast laid out with all the care of a royal kitchen. Every gesture came in its fixed order. Some ceremonies ran on for hours, through drifting clouds of incense, in halls where painted columns rose like a stone forest into the shadows overhead, and through all of it the king stood, knelt, and offered exactly as prescribed, never yawning, never slouching, while scribes recorded and priests. Every word had its ancient form, old already when the king's grandfather first learned it. Precision was the entire point, for the rite maintained ma'at, and my art was not the sort of thing one maintained by improvising. Observed, and the smoke curled slowly toward a ceiling painted with stars. And every bit of this, the washing, the robing, the whole choreographed conversation with heaven, took place before he had done a single thing that we would recognize as governing. The dispatches, the audiences, the judgments, the grain reports, all of that came afterward. By the time the sun stood fully clear of the horizon, the most powerful man in the world had already completed a full shift, and his actual job had not yet begun. And what a job it was, and what colleagues came with it. For the quiet truth about being a living God was that a number of people at court held opinions about the succession, and not all of them were inclined to wait for nature. The palace was full of smiles, and a king learned to read smiles the way his officials read the river. The guards were loyal, genuinely, mostly, probably. The advisers agreed with everything he said, which was its own quiet kind of warning. Even the royal cupbearer, a person of surprisingly high rank, poured the wine with an attentiveness that a thoughtful king might find either soothing or very much the opposite. Then there was the family. A pharaoh might have several wives and a great many children, which was splendid for the dynasty and complicated for the dinner table, since every half-brother was, viewed from a certain angle, a candidate. The women's quarters of the palace formed a world of their own, with estates and staff and long, patient influence, and history records at least one occasion when that influence turned sharp. Late in the reign of Ramesses III, a conspiracy took shape there to set a lesser son upon the throne. It failed, and we know of it because the trial records survive, dry and careful documents about an affair that was anything but. Some modern examinations of the king's mummy suggest the plot may have reached him after all. The court papers, tactful to the very last line, never quite say. So kings took precautions, the sensible ones and the superstitious ones alike, because after a while it becomes difficult to tell the difference. The king slept behind guarded doors in chambers that could be sealed, and if he kept something reassuring within reach of the pillow, history is in no position to blame him. But the most exhausting precaution was the invisible one, the lifelong performance of unconcern. A god does not glance twice at his wine cup. A god is not nervous at banquets. Worry, once glimpsed, became information, and information at court had a way of ripening into ambition. So he remained serene, from first light to last lamp, serene in a way that took real, daily effort, which is perhaps the most human thing about him. Public life offered no rest either, because Egypt dearly loved a procession. The greatest of these festivals at Thebes was Opet, when the golden bark of Amun was lifted onto the shoulders of priests and carried from the temple of Karnak along the processional way to Luxor, a journey of cheering crowds and resting stations, with bread and beer given out freely along the... On festival days, the whole apparatus of the state poured out into the streets, standards and sunlight, chantresses shaking their bronze rattles, the mingled smell of incense and river mud and baking bread, and at the centre of it all, gleaming and slowly overheating, the king. Root, which has never once hurt a ruler's popularity. He blessed sacred cattle, dedicated new buildings, and received offerings from nobles with impeccable graciousness, holding upon his face the expression of a man having a profound spiritual experience rather than an extremely warm one. The black kohl around the royal eyes, which everyone of rank wore, was not improved by the temperature. And if he faltered, if the divine shoulders sagged or the wave grew mechanical, the murmuring would begin, because a tired king was an omen, in exactly the way that everything in Egypt was an omen. The most personal of all these performances came late in a long reign. The Set Festival, the Royal Jubilee, celebrated in principle after 30 years upon the throne. Its centrepiece was disarmingly literal. The aging king ran. Actually ran before the assembled court around a marked ceremonial course to demonstrate that his vigour endured and the land was safe in his hands. Picture it kindly. A man of perhaps 60, ruler of the wealthiest nation on earth, jogging a sacred circuit in ritual dress, while everyone of consequence in Egypt looked on and drew their conclusions. Some kings celebrated several jubilees. Ramesses II, who reigned for some 66 years and lived, by most reckonings, past 90, celebrated more than a dozen, and one gently hopes the course was shortened for him toward the end. Even the banquets were labour. Seated above everyone, observed by everyone, the king could hardly loosen so much as an expression. It was theatre, every hour of it, and he was the entire cast. And behind all of this, behind the crowns and the omens and the processions, stood the institution that made a king's divinity official, the priesthood. It would be a mistake to picture Egyptian temples as quiet chapels. They were the great engines of the economy. A major temple owned farmland and herds, workshops and fishing rights, quarries and ships. It held granaries that could feed whole districts through a lean year. It ran the schools where scribes learned their letters, in what the Egyptians called the House of Life, kept archives, employed thousands, and did all of this, in the New Kingdom especially, with generous exemption from the taxes ordinary Egypt paid. The estate of Ammon at Karnak swelled over the generations into something very like a state within the state, and its high priest became a figure whose quiet opinion carried the weight of full granaries. The king wore the crown. The temples, to a degree that would have startled no one at court, held the ledgers. And the priests held something subtler as well, the interpretation of everything. Omens, festivals, the calendar of lucky and unlucky days, the meaning of a strange star or a thin harvest, all of it passed through their learning before it reached the people as truth. A priesthood that admired its king could make the heavens smile upon him. A priesthood that did not could read the very same sky rather differently. So the wise Pharaoh built for them, endowed them, chose their leaders with enormous care, and kept the whole gorgeous machine turning, god and priest and king, each one holding up the others, none of them entirely free to let go. It was, in its way, a partnership. The temple certified his divinity, and his divinity guaranteed their world. And somewhere in the middle of that arrangement stood one tired man in a heavy crown, being magnificent on schedule, day after golden day, while the river rose and fell exactly as it pleased. And then, of course, there was the money. You might imagine a living god would be spared the indignity of worrying about the treasury, but the truth was quite the opposite. Gold flowed out of the palace far more easily than it flowed in. It went to the temples, to the monuments, to the army, to the slow, patient machinery of the court, and refilling the coffers generally meant one of three things: a war, a very good harvest sold abroad, or a diplomatic squeeze applied to the merchant caravans winding through your territory. The priesthood of Amun at Karnak came to control estates and granaries, workshops and quarries, fleets of river barges and herds of cattle beyond easy counting, and it was said, only half in jest, that a golden statue in a temple sanctuary enjoyed better long-term security than a general of the. Meanwhile, the great temples grew quietly richer with every season. Royal Army. The priests themselves were a puzzle, no pharaoh ever quite solved. To your face they were devotion itself. "We live only to serve your divine will," they would murmur, bowing low through the incense smoke. Yet somehow, behind the bowing, resources drifted steadily toward the temples, information travelled along channels you could not see, and advice reached your rivals that blended prayer with something rather more practical. You were the shining figure at the summit of the world, the living God, the Son made flesh, and they were, in effect, the committee that decided precisely how divine you would be permitted to be that year. If you pushed against the temples, the countryside stirred uneasily, because the people loved their gods and the priests spoke for the gods. If you gave the temples everything they asked, you slowly became a beautiful ornament carried along in their processions. It was a power struggle conducted entirely through courtesy, incense, and very long silences, and the longer you reigned, the more clearly you understood a quiet truth of Egyptian life. The gods might dwell in the heavens, but their accountants kept excellent offices at Karnak. Then there was your family. In most households, in most centuries, family trouble means a forgotten birthday or a sharp remark over dinner. In the palace of a pharaoh, family trouble meant factions, whispered alliances, and, every so often, a misfortune by the river that everyone agreed, a little too quickly, had been an accident. It was the people who shared his own blood. You grew up, and then grew old, in a palace filled with brothers and half-brothers, cousins, uncles, and nephews, every one of whom could trace a path, with modest imagination, from the corridor where he stood to the throne where you sat. Some were ambitious, some were merely dreamers, all of them were worth watching. Succession was the heart of the trouble. Egypt never settled on a tidy rule that the eldest son simply inherited everything. In practice, the next pharaoh was whichever candidate combined survival, timing, the right mother, and the approval of the priesthood. And everyone at court knew it. So half the palace quietly guessed which of your sons would one day wear the double crown, and the other half worked, just as quietly, to make sure it would not be the wrong one. Your children were raised less like children and more like promising racehorses. Each had his own tutors, household, supporters, and attentive informants, and behind each stood a mother who told her son bedtime stories in which the gods, by remarkable coincidence, always favoured him. Your brothers and uncles, meanwhile, were rarely content to remain dignified background figures at festivals. It was quietly understood that each of them kept the friendship of at least one useful general, and that palace staircases, in certain reigns, had acquired a curious reputation for mishaps. And then there were the queens, plural, because a pharaoh married more than once, and the royal women often lived within the same sprawling household, a city within a city of courtyards and gardens and cool painted rooms. These were intelligent, formidable women, many managing estates and correspondents of their own, and among them alliances formed and dissolved with the patience and precision of master strategists. A careless word in the wrong pavilion could ripple outward for months. Small wonder that the royal kitchens were careful places, that tasters sampled the wine before it reached the royal lips, and that every dish arrived at the table through several pairs of trusted hands. Nothing so crude as an open threat, of course. Just an atmosphere, faint as perfume, in which everyone around you was either your relative or your possible successor, and quite often both. Even death brought no calm. In such a court, every passing became a suspicious passing, every illness a subject of speculation, every cough in a corridor a fresh topic for temple gossip. And your own burial was not beyond the reach of politics, for tombs were entered by thieves, names were chiselled away, and a perfectly loyal son might finish his father's monument, and then, without visible embarrassment, begin planning a larger one for himself. So after a lifetime of ritual, vigilance, desert heat, and relatives, you finally died, and you might reasonably expect that your work was done. But in Egypt, being dead did not mean being finished. It simply meant your last and longest duty had begun, for the journey to the next world was managed with the thoroughness of a state project. The embalmers received you promptly, and for roughly 70 days you were the most carefully attended person in the kingdom. Your internal organs were removed with great reverence and placed in canopic jars, each watched over by its own guardian deity, a small protective committee bearing the heads of a falcon, a jackal, a baboon, and a man. The brain, tradition had decided, would not be needed where you were going, and was quietly set aside, for Egyptians held that the heart, not the head, was the seat of thought and memory, and the heart stayed exactly where it was. Then you were dried in natron salts, anointed with oils and fragrant resins, and wrapped in layer upon layer of fine linen, with protective amulets tucked between the windings, until the mightiest ruler on earth resembled a very dignified, very well-documented parcel. Next came the coffins, and yes, that word is plural too. You were placed inside a nested series of increasingly magnificent cases, wood and gold leaf and inlaid glass, one within another like a divine set of nesting dolls, every surface crowded with inscriptions and protective spells, in case the road to the afterlife proved less friendly than advertised. And then, the centerpiece of it all, the tomb. You had spent a good part of your reign, and a genuinely alarming share of the kingdom's wealth, preparing this eternal home, its walls painted with prayers, maps of the underworld, and generously flattering images of yourself triumphing over enemies who were unlikely to trouble anyone ever again. Unfortunately, a treasure house built to proclaim immortality also proclaimed, to a certain kind of listener, that there was treasure inside. Despite curses carved over doorways, despite guards and sealed corridors and passages designed to mislead, most royal tombs were quietly emptied within a few generations, and some, it seems, within living memory of the funeral. Surviving court records from later reigns describe solemn investigations into tomb robbery, which tells you both that the state took the matter very seriously and that it kept happening anyway. So while the priests chanted for your eternal spirit, somewhere in the dark a practical-minded person was already leaving with your gilded footstool. And here lay the deepest worry of all, the one that kept even a god-king thoughtful. In Egyptian belief, existence in the next world depended on remembrance in this one. If your name was spoken, you lived. If your name was erased, if your image was defaced, if your resting place was scattered, then the door to eternity quietly closed. Which meant that a single ambitious successor with a chisel could do to your soul what no army had managed to do to your body. You could rule for decades and still end up, 3,000 years later, lying in a climate-controlled case, while schoolchildren file past mispronouncing your name and wondering, in whispers, whether your curse is still active. And remember, all of this was only the paperwork. You had not even reached the judgment hall yet. For someone presented as an immortal being, you also spent a surprising amount of time in mortal danger, because pharaohs were expected to lead their armies in person, not symbolically. Personally. When war came, the living god climbed into a chariot, took up bow and blade, and rode north or south at the head of the column, usually before the morning had properly cooled. Your generals drew up the plans, and your scribes drafted the victory inscriptions, sometimes with admirable confidence, well in advance. But you had to be there, visible at the front in the blue war crown, because divine authority only worked if people could see divinity showing up. Waiting in a tent at the rear, in the fashion of certain later kings, was simply not available to you. You rode forward, raised the ceremonial axe, called out that the gods marched with Egypt, and hoped, very sincerely, that the enemy's archers were having an off year. Even victory came with obligations. A pharaoh could not win quietly. There had to be a homecoming, a triumph. Prisoners and plunder and tribute paraded through cheering streets, while you stood in the sunlight trying to look humble and overwhelming at once. And afterward the scribes recorded the totals with the loving precision of accountants. But defeat was a genuine crisis, because pharaohs, by definition, did not lose. If you came home diminished, the priests might read it as a sign of divine displeasure, and divine displeasure had a way of becoming a conversation about alternatives. So you found yourself walking a wheel that never stopped turning, raise revenue to fund the campaign, fight the campaign to protect the royal image, then build a monument enlarging the campaign in case anyone had noticed how close it had been. The most famous example is gently instructive. Ramesses II fought a great chariot battle at Kadesh that, by most sober modern readings, ended in something like an elaborate draw, and he then spent years carving it across the walls of Egypt as one of the most glorious victories the world had ever seen. That is not lying, exactly. That is management of the royal brand, at monumental scale. And the final indignity was this. After the rituals, the wars, the watchful relatives, and the linen-wrapped paperwork of eternity, your legacy never truly belonged to you. You could raise the grandest temple of the age and carve your name on every obelisk from the Delta to Nubia, and it took only one successor with a grievance and a chisel for you to begin, officially, never having existed. Names were cut away, statues were recarved, and achievements migrated tidily onto the monuments of later kings. It is said that the great female pharaoh Hatshepsut, after a long and prosperous reign, had her images methodically removed by those who came after, so that for centuries she nearly vanished from her own story. And erasure was not mere pettiness. In Egyptian eyes it was something closer to a second, quieter ending, since a soul without a spoken name had nowhere left to stand. Even when they did not erase you, they edited you. Difficult battles ripened into triumphs. Ordinary kings acquired heroic tempers, and embarrassing incidents involving crocodiles slipped politely out of the record. Future generations treated each reign like a group project in which nobody had quite read the notes. You were remembered not as you were, but as whatever made the next fellow look best. You ruled as the chosen of Ra, Lord of the Two Lands, Keeper of the Sunrise, and your final reward was to be cheerfully summarized several thousand years later by a travel writer working from memory. So let us leave the warm river now, and the incense, and the patient accountants of Karnak, and travel a very long way north, to a colder sea and a harder sky, where royalty was a different business altogether. Here there were no pyramids, only pine forests, deep fjords, and long winters, and a king was not the sun made flesh, but simply the strongest branch of a quarrelsome family tree. Into this world, in the year 1015, was born a boy named Harold Sigurdsson, arriving, we may reasonably assume, at the top of his voice, into a Norway that was already restless. His half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, was campaigning season after season to gather the country under a single crown, and it was not going smoothly. The great landowning families resented him, the Danes wanted him gone entirely, and the old customs of the north were straining under the weight of a new Christian idea of kingship. Harold's cradle, in other words, stood in a landscape of shifting alliances and long-remembered feuds. His family was well suited to such a world. His father, Sigurd Seer, was a minor king in the uplands, a careful man, more farmer than warrior by temperament, but wealthy and widely respected. His mother, Asta Gudbrandsdatter, was the true fire of the household, ambitious, shrewd, and devoutly Christian, and she was also the mother of Olaf himself, the man who would one day be remembered as Saint Olaf. That made young Harold royal by blood and by expectation, a younger brother growing up in the long shadow of a warrior king who was trying to pull a whole country into unity. Nobody raised Harold as a child who might someday amount to something. He was trained, from the beginning, as a piece already on the board. By 10 he could handle a sword. By 11 he rode well. And by 15, remarkably, he was riding to war, because that was the year everything broke. Olaf had lost his throne to Danish power and gone into exile, and in 1030 he came back across the mountains with a loyal, threadbare army to reclaim it, marching toward a farm called Stickelstad and a battle that would be his last. And beside him, in mail that can hardly have fit him yet, rode Harold, 15 years old, carrying rather too much idealism and not nearly enough fear. The battle went against them from the start, and by the time the long summer evening settled over the fields, the king had fallen and his cause was scattered. Harold, wounded and surely half in shock, was carried away and hidden, and the sagas tell of a quiet convalescence at a remote farmstead in the hills while the countryside was searched. From that day forward, Harold was never a child again. He was a fugitive, a survivor, a young man shaped by defeat, and when his wound had healed he slipped eastward over the cold spine of Scandinavia, through Sweden and onward into the wide rivers and dark forests of the land of the Russ. To most Norwegians that road meant exile. To Harold it looked even then like a second chance. For the realm of the Rus was a rising power in those years, part Slavic, part Norse, tinted with the gold of Byzantium, and it was ruled by a careful, cultivated prince remembered as Yaroslav the Wise. Fortunately for Harold, Yaroslav had a soft spot for well-connected northern royalty, and more fortunately still, his court was already full of Norse fighting men who had travelled the same rivers. Harold fit in immediately, but this was no comfortable guest apartment in a friendly palace. He signed on to fight, and fight he did, against raiders, against the horsemen of the steppes, against rebellious princes, learning his trade one campaign at a time. In the service of Yaroslav the Wise, Harold earned his scars and his silver. He was barely more than a boy when he arrived at the court of Kiev, and yet within a year or so, it is said, he was trusted with a command of his own, which says something about how quickly he made an impression in a land that did not hand out armies as party favours. Yaroslav had no shortage of work for a promising young warrior. His realm was a river empire, a long chain of trading towns strung along the waterways between the Baltic and the Black Sea, and holding it together meant campaigns against the Poles, trouble along the steppe frontier, and the endless patient business of escorting wealth up and down the Dnieper. Harold turned out to be good at all of it. He was tall, strikingly so, and clever in a way that surprised people who assumed a Norse prince would solve his problems mainly by hitting them. Where other warriors charged straight ahead, he circled, he feinted. He waited, sometimes maddeningly long, for the precise moment when a fight would tip over under its own weight. Men who served under him learned discipline. Men who faced him learned regret and then, usually, learned to be somewhere else. He also, the sagas tell us, fell in love. The lady was Elisaveta, one of Yaroslav's daughters, known in the north as Elisif. Yaroslav, a practical father with an empire to think about, is said to have observed, kindly but firmly, that a landless exile with no crown and no treasury was, however impressive, still a landless exile with no crown and no treasury. Harold appears to have taken the point without argument. If he wanted the princess, he would need gold, and not a modest amount of it. We will come back to Elisif, because Harold certainly intended to. By now, the desperate teenager who had been carried wounded out of Norway was gone, and something considerably more formidable had grown up in his place. He was a commander in exile, seasoned, wealthy enough to be comfortable, and entirely unsatisfied. The land of the Rus had been good to him, but it was never meant to be the destination. It was the forge, and the iron had plans of its own. Getting there meant weeks on the water, gliding down the Dnieper past cataracts where the boats had to be carried overland, while everyone kept a thoughtful eye on the tree line, then out across the Black Sea, until at last the horizon produced walls and towers and more rooftops than a northern. So in the middle years of the 1030s, Harold looked south, down the long river road every ambitious northerner knew by reputation, toward the one city that outshone all others. The Norse called it Miklagard, the great city. We call it Constantinople. Imagination had words for. Inside them lay marble avenues and crowded markets, the smell of incense and salt and charcoal, domes catching the morning light off the water, and above everything the vast rounded shoulder of Hagia Sophia. A church so large that visitors sometimes simply stood in the doorway and forgot what they. Constantinople in those years was the richest city in the world, and it did not bother to be modest about it. Its land walls rose in triple lines that had shrugged off armies for 6 centuries, had come to say. Travellers told of the palace, where the emperor sat on a throne flanked by gilded lions that could be made to roar, while jewelled birds sang in artificial trees. Whether or not Harold believed those stories before he arrived, the truth, when he finally saw it, was strange enough. And this glittering empire had a standing need for exactly one commodity. The North produced in abundance large, loyal, dangerous men. The emperors kept an elite bodyguard, recruited mostly from Norsemen and later from Anglo-Saxons as well, called the Varangian Guard. Their duties were straightforward: guard the emperor, fight his wars, and keep a long axe within easy reach in case palace politics became energetic. Harold joined them, and it is fair to say the guard got rather more than it bargained for. He rose quickly. His height turned heads, his record spoke for itself, and his particular blend of ferocity and patience made him the kind of officer emperors like to send toward problems. Over the following years, Harold's career reads like a tour of the whole Mediterranean world. He fought in Sicily against Arab forces, serving alongside one of Byzantium's most celebrated and most famously difficult generals. He hunted pirates through the islands of the Aegean. He marched across the dry hills of Anatolia, and he travelled as far as the Holy Land itself, reaching Jerusalem, where legend says he bathed in the river Jordan and made a quiet vow that one day he would rule a kingdom of his own. It is exactly the sort of detail the sagas love, and whether or not the river was involved, the vow certainly was. But Harold was doing more in Constantinople than swinging an axe. He was watching. Byzantine politics were a slow, elegant, extremely dangerous dance, conducted by courtiers, generals, and palace officials who smiled beautifully at one another while manoeuvring for position. Harold never learned to out-scheme them, and to his credit he does not seem to have tried. His method was simpler. He outlasted them. Emperors came and went during his years of service, sometimes peacefully, sometimes very much not, and through every change of management the tall Norwegian was still there, still standing near the throne, still being paid. And paid he was. Between his wages, his share of campaign spoils, and the traditional gifts that flowed toward useful men, Harold became rich on a scale no raid on a rainy coastline could have imagined. Some accounts suggest he shipped chest after chest of treasure north to Yaroslav's court for safekeeping, which, if true, was both prudent banking and a rather pointed message to a certain princess's father. The boy who had fled Norway in furs now wore silk. The exile who had owned nothing now held more gold than most kings, and had better manners than several of them. It could not last, of course. An ambitious foreigner with too much money, too much experience, and too many friends among the soldiery is exactly the sort of person Byzantine emperors were trained to worry about. And eventually the palace began to regard Harold the way one regards a large dog that has learned to open doors. Accounts of his departure differ, and the sagas, never shy, make it a proper adventure, complete with a night flight across the harbour, where a great chain was stretched over the water, as much to keep ships in as to keep enemies out. The story goes that Harold ordered every man to the stern, ran his galley up onto the chain, then sent them all scrambling forward, so that the ship tipped over the barrier and slid free into open water. It is almost certainly too good to be entirely true, and far too good not to mention. However he managed it, Harold left the great city the way he had survived everything else, with nerve, muscle, and a stubbornness you could have anchored ships to. He had spent nearly 10 years fighting for emperors. He was finished fighting for anyone but himself. The road home ran back up the rivers to Kiev, where a satisfying piece of unfinished business was waiting. Harold was no longer a landless exile with no crown and no treasury. He was one of the wealthiest men in the northern world, and Yaroslav, reviewing the situation with a practical father's eye, found that his earlier objections had quietly evaporated. Harold married Elisif, the princess he had gone south for, and when he finally sailed for Scandinavia, he travelled as a man who had, so far, obtained essentially everything he had ever set out to obtain. That is a dangerous habit to bring home. Norway, it must be said, did not arrange anything resembling a welcome. The country already had a king, and a well-liked one, Magnus, called the Good, the young son of Harold's half-brother Olaf, the same Olaf who had fallen at Stiklestad, and was now, by one of history's gentler ironies, revered as a saint. Magnus had done well for himself. He held not only Norway but Denmark too, and his rule was popular and reasonably steady. What Magnus did not have was Harold's decade of Byzantine warfare, Harold's mountain of gold, or Harold's ambition, and all three of those things were now sailing toward him. Harold opened negotiations the way he preferred to, by acquiring an army. His treasure hired fighters from across the lands of the Rus and Sweden, and he struck a bargain with Svein Estridsson, a Danish lord with his own claim to Denmark and his own grievance against Magnus. Each promised to help the other, an alliance built entirely out of longships and mutual resentment, which in that era was considered a perfectly sound foundation. But the invasion never quite had to happen. Magnus, watching a civil war assemble itself on his horizon, made a startling and rather wise offer. He would share the throne of Norway with his uncle, and in exchange Harold would share that famous treasure. So the two men ruled together, the gentle young king and the returned war machine, with all the easy warmth of two cats assigned to the same basket. It was an arrangement nobody expected to last, and it did not. In 1047, barely 2 years in, Magnus died suddenly. Most accounts say illness. A few, inevitably, murmured darker things, as people always do when a throne changes hands conveniently. It is said that before he died, Magnus divided his inheritance, leaving Norway to Harold and Denmark to Svein. Harold accepted exactly half of that arrangement. Norway he took without hesitation. Denmark, in his view, was simply unfinished business. And so began one of the longest grudges in Scandinavian history. For the better part of 2 decades, nearly every summer, Harold's fleet went south to the Danish coasts, the way other men keep a standing appointment. There were raids and skirmishes, and one enormous sea battle off the mouth of the river Nissa, and Harold won far more often than he lost, yet the prize never stayed won. Denmark bent and then straightened. Svein lost battles, lost ships, occasionally lost everything but his life, and somehow always resurfaced, damp and undefeated in the one way that mattered. Slowly the war stopped being about conquest and became about pride, an argument neither man knew how to end, until at last, worn smooth by the years, they made peace, and each kept exactly what he had started with. One imagines the strange quiet in Norway's harbours that first summer no fleet sailed. At home, meanwhile, Harold ruled precisely the way you would expect a Varangian veteran to rule. He raised taxes and, more remarkably, actually collected them. He centralized power, sidelined the proud regional chieftains, and made it understood that opposing the king was a hobby with poor long-term prospects. Nobles who disagreed with him tended to discover urgent reasons to be elsewhere. With his wealth he maintained a standing fleet and a corps of loyal warriors, a luxury no Norwegian king before him could have afforded. He minted proper coins with his own name pressed into the silver. He built churches, encouraged trade, and founded a little market town at the head of a sheltered fjord, a town that would, in the fullness of time, grow up to be called Oslo, which is a respectable legacy all by itself. His people gave him the name history remembers, Hardrada, the hard ruler, the man of hard counsel. It was not entirely a compliment, it was entirely accurate. Yet he was never only steel. Harold composed poetry, frequently on the subject of himself, a topic on which he considered himself uniquely well informed, and he kept skalds at his court to polish his deeds into verses that would outlive him. He maintained trading contacts across Europe and, some say, kept a quiet line open to Constantinople, just in case. And as the Sen-60s arrived and the grey climbed into his beard, he began preparing his son Olaf for the throne. He had every reason to expect a long final act. A few more decades of stern kingship, then a legendary old age surrounded by gold, grandchildren, and flattering poetry. History, as it turned out, had made other arrangements. In January of 1066, far away in England, Edward the Confessor died without a child to follow him, and one of the great succession crises of the Middle Ages swung open like a door left unlatched. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, was crowned almost at once. Across the Channel, William of Normandy insisted the throne had been promised to him and began building ships. And in the far north, Harold Hardrada, nearing 50 but still built like the prow of a warship, took out his own claim and examined it. It rested on an old agreement between his nephew Magnus and a former Danish king of England, a pact that whichever of the two outlived the other should inherit his realm. As legal reasoning goes, it was, to put it gently, well seasoned. But Harold subscribed to the older northern arithmetic, in which a thin claim plus a large army equals a throne, and the army he could supply personally. He found an ally, too, Tostig Godwinson, the new English king's own brother, exiled, embittered, and generous with promises that England would rise to meet them. Tostig offered legitimacy of a sort. Harold offered everything else. In the late summer of 1066, he gathered perhaps 300 ships and something like 10,000 men, and the fleet came down across the North Sea, the way fleets from the north had come for 2.5 centuries, sails taut with cold wind, hulls hissing softly through the grey swells. Except this was no raid. This was a full invasion, the last great voyage of the Viking Age, led by the last great Viking king. In September the ships entered the Humber and rowed up toward York. At Fulford, just outside the city, 2 English earls hurried out with whatever forces they could gather, and Harold's veterans broke them in a single hard morning. The gates of the north swung open and York came to terms. Everything, for the moment, was going the way the old magic said it should. Harold moved his camp to a river crossing east of the city called Stamford Bridge and settled in to collect hostages from the surrounding countryside. The day appointed for the exchange was warm, unusually warm for a Yorkshire September, and many of his men, expecting paperwork rather than trouble, had left their heavy mail coats behind with the ships. And then, on the road from the south, a cloud of dust appeared, and beneath it a long line of something glinting, which the sagas say looked like sunlight on a field of broken ice. It was not a delegation bringing hostages, it was the English army. Harold Godwinson had driven his men north from London at a pace no one believed possible, covering nearly 200 miles in a handful of days, and he had arrived exactly where the Norwegians were most comfortable and least prepared. On that warm morning of the 25th of September, the two armies faced each other across the little river, and the fate of England, and of the whole Viking Age with it, quietly stepped onto the scales. And so the story carries us to a September morning in the year 1066, to a stretch of low green meadow beside the River Derwent in the north of England, at a crossing called Stamford Bridge. It is worth lingering on how peacefully the day began, because almost nothing about it suggested what it would become. The summer had overstayed its welcome that year, and the morning of the 25th was unseasonably warm, the kind of warmth that makes armour feel like an unreasonable suggestion. Harold Hardrada's army had fought and won a battle only days before, at Fulford, just outside York, and the camp was wrapped in the particular contentment of soldiers who believed the difficult part is behind them. This was supposed to be a quiet day, an errand of a day. The city of York had come to terms. Hostages were to be exchanged, formalities observed, papers, so to speak, signed. Harold brought only part of his force to the meeting place, and because the sun was high and the walk was long, a great many of the men left their mail shirts behind at the ships, moored miles away down the river. One can picture them, thousands of Norsemen scattered along the riverbank in the sunshine, helmets off, shields stacked, some of them dozing in the grass, the river sliding quietly past, the air full of insects and the smell of warm earth. It is one of history's gentler ironies that the last morning of the Viking Age was, for an hour or two, very nearly idyllic. Then someone noticed the dust. Far off, along the road from York, a low cloud was rising, and beneath it something glittered, points of light winking and shifting, the way sunlight catches on metal. The sagas say the Norwegians watched it for a while, puzzled, the way one watches weather. It grew. The glitter resolved into spear points and mail, rank upon rank of them, and the truth arrived all at once. This was an army, an English army, and it should not have been possible. Harold Godwinson, the new English king, was supposed to be far away in the south, watching the coast for a different invasion entirely. Instead, he had done something soldiers would still be studying centuries later. On hearing that the Norwegians had landed, he had gathered his household troops and marched them the length of England, something close to 180 miles, in only 4 or 5 days, gathering local levies as he went, moving at a pace armies of that era were simply not supposed to manage. He arrived unannounced, unadvertised, and thoroughly uninvited, and the Norwegian army, scattered, sun-warmed, and largely unarmoured, looked up from the riverbank to discover that the negotiation had been cancelled. What followed was confusion before it was anything else. Harold sent riders galloping back toward the ships to summon the rest of the army and, crucially, everyone's armour, and then set about the impossible task of arranging startled men into a battle line. The English were coming on quickly, and the one piece of geography working in the Norwegians' favour was the bridge itself, a narrow wooden crossing over the Derwent that the English would have to funnel across. Here, the story offers one of the most enduring legends of the entire era. A single Norse warrior, a huge man whose name nobody thought to write down, planted himself in the middle of that bridge with a long axe and, according to the English chronicles themselves, held the crossing alone. For a long, strange stretch of the afternoon, the tale goes, one man postponed the collision of two kingdoms. The accounts, it must be said, grew grander with every retelling, as such accounts do, but even the sober versions agree that he stood and stayed and bought his king precious time until at last the English found a way past him and the bridge was theirs. Whoever he was, he became a legend before the sun went down, proof that in a Viking story even the footnotes are epic. Beyond the river, Harold had shaped his men into a shield wall on the rising ground, a ring of overlapping shields with his famous banner, Land Waster, planted at its heart. The wall held longer than it had any right to, considering how many of the men behind those shields wore nothing but linen shirts. Harold himself fought the way he had fought since he was 15 years old at Stiklestad, out in front, enormous, unmistakable, swinging his sword two-handed, and, we are told, reciting verses as he went, composing poetry about his own last battle even while he fought it. He was around 50 years old, and for a while, the sagas insist, it was as if the decades had never touched him. But numbers and armour tell in the end, as they always do. The wall bent and thinned, and somewhere in the press of that long afternoon, an arrow found the king. Late in the day, their comrades from the ships arrived at a dead run, led by the nobleman Eystein Orri. Having covered the miles in full mail under a hot sun, spent before they ever reached the field, they threw themselves into one last effort, remembered afterward as Orri's Storm, brave, doomed, and... The sagas give the moment a single line, and perhaps that is the kindest way. Harold Sigurdsson, who had survived Stiklestad and the steppes and the intrigues of 3 emperors, fell on English grass and did not rise. His men, given every reason to break, mostly did not. By evening, it was over. Of the 300 ships that had carried the Norwegian host across the North Sea that summer, the survivors needed only 24 to carry them home. Harald's young son Olaf was allowed to sail in peace, having given his word that Norway would not come again. It was a promise, as things turned out, that the whole Norse world would keep. Now, history rarely lets its victors catch their breath, and Harold Godwinson's reward for the march of his life was another march. So the weary English army turned around and walked the length of the country all over again, and on the 14th of October, barely 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, Harold Godwinson met William near Hastings, and there, at the end of that long autumn, he fell in his turn, and England passed. Within days of the victory came word from the south coast. A second fleet had landed, this one from Normandy, led by Duke William, who also believed the English crown belonged to him. It had been that kind of year for England, 3 kings' worth of ambition aimed at one island. Into Norman hands. Historians have puzzled over the arithmetic of it ever since. Had Harold Hardrada never sailed, the English army would have been rested, whole, and waiting on the right coast. There is a certain dry Norse humour in that, viewed from the right angle, Harold changed English history forever, just not remotely in the way he intended. Back in Norway, the news came home with the 24 ships, travelling from fjord to fjord like a change in the weather. The invincible one, the man who had escaped Stickelstad, commanded the Emperor's guard in Constantinople, out-schemed the schemers of Byzantium, and ruled Norway with a hand of iron for 20 years, was gone. His son Olaf took the throne, and here the story performs one of its quietest and loveliest turns. Olaf was not his father, seems to have known it, and appears to have been entirely at peace with the fact. History remembers him as Olaf Kyrre, Olaf the Quiet, and under his long, calm reign. Norway did something it had scarcely tried before, nothing dramatic whatsoever. Trade grew. Towns took root and prospered, Bergen among them. Churches of stone rose where turf halls had stood, and with them came books and quiet and bells across the water. The longships still slid down the fjords on summer mornings, but more and more they carried wool and fish and timber rather than warriors. No more monasteries watching the horizon in dread, no more kings gazing west with silver in their eyes. The fire that had burned across 3 centuries banked itself down into lamplight, still warm, still bright, but domestic now. The sagas would go on being told, all the louder as the world they described receded. But the men who had lived them were passing into memory, and Norway, almost with a sigh of relief, settled into being simply one medieval kingdom among many. As for Harold, death proved only a mild inconvenience to his reputation. Few figures of the Middle Ages left so long awake. The Icelanders gave him pride of place in the Heimskringla, the great chronicle of Norway's kings. The English recorded him in the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, the Byzantines remembered, in their own manuals of statecraft, a towering northerner who had served the palace well. Historians have argued ever since about what exactly he was, poet or plunderer, statesman or storm, and the honest answer seems to be all of it at once, sometimes in the same afternoon. He composed careful verses and burned coastlines. He built churches and emptied treasuries. He founded the little trading town of Oslo, which would one day be a capital, and he spent his final morning trying to add another country to his collection. Even his nickname declines to flatter him. Hardrada, the hard ruler, was not an endearment whispered fondly by his subjects. It was a plain description, offered by people who had learned over 20 years that this particular king did not bend. And yet no Norseman ever travelled farther, saw more, or packed more incident into a single lifetime, from the snows of his childhood farm to the golden domes above the Bosporus and back again, 3 lives' worth of story spent in about 50 years. When he fell, an age fell with him, and historians, who can rarely agree on where to place the bookends of anything, largely agree on this one. The Viking Age opens with a raid on a quiet island monastery in 793, and it closes at Stamford Bridge with Harold. And since we've been speaking of endings, this seems the right moment to drift a little deeper into the Norse world and ask how these people imagined an ending, because their answer, characteristically, involved a ship. To the Viking mind, a ship was never merely planks and rivets and a well-cut sail. It was the sum of everything that mattered: livelihood, freedom, status, motion itself. You traded by ship, travelled by ship, grew wealthy or famous by ship, and so it seemed only sensible that when the time came, you would depart by ship as well. Death, in this way of seeing things, was not a wall, but a crossing. One more voyage over one more grey sea to a farther shore. And a voyage, naturally, requires a vessel. That is why the great ship burials were so elaborate. For a chieftain, a queen, or anyone of real consequence, an actual ship, sometimes 70 feet of oak with a carved prow curling up like a fern frond, would be hauled ashore and settled into a trench in the earth. The dead were laid amidships, often on a made-up bed piled with furs, dressed in their finest, as if for a journey of state. Then the loading began, and the inventory reads like the packing list of someone expecting a long and eventful trip. Weapons, since one ought to arrive prepared. Tools and cooking gear. Chests of clothing and jewellery. Sledges and wagons. Food and drink for the road. Animals went too. Horses, hounds, sometimes hawks, companions in life sent along as companions after it. And it should be said plainly, because it is true, that in some burials people went as well, servants and enslaved attendants sent to follow those they had served. The custom is attested by saga and archaeology alike, and it sits heavily on modern ears, as it should. The ordinary people caught up in it deserved to be remembered as people, and not as belongings, whatever their masters believed. To the Norse, inside their own cosmos, it was framed as honour and continuing service. Then the whole assembly, ship and goods and all, was sealed beneath tons of earth, raising a broad green mound that would stand beside fjord or field for 1,000 years, saying to everyone who passed, "Here rests someone who mattered enough to be given a ship to the next world." For a long time such burials lived mostly in the sagas, halfway to fable. Then the earth itself began handing them back. In 1904, on a farm in southeastern Norway, the excavation of a great mound uncovered something astonishing: a complete oak longship, roughly 70 feet of it, preserved almost perfectly by the dense, airtight clay it had slept in for more than 1,000 years. This was the Oseberg ship, and it remains one of the most beautiful objects to survive from the entire Viking world. Its prow rising in a slender spiral, its timbers alive with carving, knotwork and beasts chasing one another along the planking. This was no raider's workhorse, it was a ceremonial vessel, a state carriage of the sea. And the surprise deepened inside, because the Oseberg ship held not a warlord but 2 women. One was elderly and clearly of the highest rank, a queen perhaps, or, as some scholars suggest, a great vulva, a seeress of wide renown. The other was younger, and her role remains uncertain: companion, kinswoman, priestess, attendant. The clay keeps that secret still. Around them lay a treasury of everyday magnificence: an ornately carved wooden cart, sledges worked as finely as jewellery, tapestries, chests, buckets, looms, and the remains of oxen and other animals given to the journey. A generation earlier, in 1880, another mound not far away had yielded the Oseberg ship's sterner cousin, the Gokstad ship, longer, plainer, and built beyond any doubt for open water. A true ocean-goer, fast and supple, the kind of vessel that had made the whole Viking Age possible in the first. Whoever the elder woman was, an entire community had paused its life to launch her into the next one, gentle proof, resting in the clay, that the voyage to the beyond was never reserved for sword-swinging men. Shields had been ranged along the rails, and he had been provisioned like a man expecting both company and entertainment. Beds, gaming pieces, cooking gear, 3 small boats nested alongside the great one, and a remarkable menagerie, 12 horses, half a dozen dogs, and, wonderfully, 2. In it lay a powerfully built man in his 40s, his name lost, his importance plain to see. Peacocks, birds that had no business being in Norway at all, and can only have arrived as exotic treasures along trade routes reaching toward the far south. Taken together, the 2 ships read less like graves than like letters, folded into the earth and addressed to the future, one speaking of ritual, artistry, and the quiet power of women, the other of voyages, wealth, and the wide world. A chieftain fully expected to keep on sailing long after the. Even in death, it seems, a Norse lord liked to show that his connections stretched well beyond the fjord. Sailing was done, the great ships resting beneath their mounds. Oseberg with its carved spirals, Gokstad with its long, clean hull built for open water, were never only graves. They were declarations. Each one announced in oak and iron and carefully arranged treasure that the person lying inside had mattered, and that their death was not an ending so much as a departure. And this may be the strangest, most quietly beautiful thing about the Norse imagination. It refused to picture the next world as a room where the dead simply waited. The afterlife was a destination. And to a seafaring people, a destination meant only one thing. Sooner or later, someone was going to need a ship. So a Viking funeral, at least for the great and powerful, was never a small affair. It was not an hour of mourning, followed by a quiet walk home. It was theatre, a long, deliberate, carefully staged rite of passage, meant to launch the dead toward whatever waited for them, and, just as importantly, to make sure that nobody standing on the shore ever forgot their name. In a world without written archives, memory was the only immortality on offer, and a spectacular funeral was how a family wrote its history into the minds of its neighbours. The mound on the hillside was, in a sense, the family's public library, and it held exactly one very important book. It began, as these things usually do, with quiet and careful work. The body was not simply laid on a heap of timber and left to the weather. It was washed and dressed with real attention. In silk, if the family's trade connection stretched far enough to the east and south, or in fine embroidered wool if they did not. Jewellery was chosen and arranged, brooches, arm rings, beads of glass and amber that had travelled farther in their lifetimes than most people ever would. Some of the dead were laid out as though peacefully asleep. Others were seated upright in a chair within the ship, dressed and dignified, facing the voyage ahead the way a captain might face the sea. Then came the ceremonies, which could stretch across many days. Our most detailed description comes from an unexpected witness, Ahmad ibn Fadlan, a diplomat and scholar from Baghdad who travelled north in the early 10th century and met the Rus, Norse traders and warriors who had settled along the great rivers of Eastern Europe. When a chieftain among them died, Ibn Fadlan wrote, "The funeral unfolded slowly, with feasting and music and offerings, the ship prepared like a stage." His account also preserves the custom's most sobering element, and it deserves to be said plainly and without decoration, the dead man did not travel alone. An enslaved young woman joined her master in death as part of the rite, treated with elaborate ceremony in her final days and regarded, in the eyes of that world, as a companion for the voyage. Historians still weigh every line of that account, and how much choice she truly had is a question the centuries cannot answer. She is remembered here as a person, not a detail. And then the story moves on, as the river did, and as the mourners did. Animals made the journey too, and in generous numbers. Horses were offered so the soul would have something to ride once the sailing was done. Dogs went along as companions and guardians, hawks as emblems of nobility, and sometimes cattle simply as provisions for a journey of unknown length. Around certain graves, mourners raised rings of standing stones, which some scholars read as a boundary line, the visible edge between the world of the living and the world the ship was bound for. As for the ship itself, its fate varied. Sometimes it was burned, sent up in flame and smoke in a farewell that could be seen for miles. More often it was lowered whole into a great pit, packed with its cargo, and sealed beneath stones and earth until it became a hill. The choice depended on status, on local custom, and sometimes on plain arithmetic, because a longship represented years of skilled labour, hundreds of trees, and a small fortune in iron rivets. Burning one was that era's equivalent of setting fire to a mansion to mark a passing. Only a family of real consequence could afford such a gesture, and that, of course, was exactly the point. These funerals were political. A great burial said, to everyone watching from the shore, this was no ordinary person. This was someone whose leaving shook the ground. Which brings us, gently, to the flaming longship, the one everyone knows. Thanks to a century of films and paintings, most people picture a Viking funeral the same way. A burning ship drifting out on dark water, flames climbing the mast, silent figures watching from a cold beach. It is a magnificent image. It is also, for the most part, an invention. The archaeological record tells a calmer story. Burial, not burning, was the common fate of funeral ships. The great mounds of Norway, Oseberg, Gokstad, Tune, all held ships that were carefully placed in the ground, loaded with grave goods, and covered over with turf and stone. Nor did one size fit all. Some ship graves were vast and extravagant, others held little more than a modest rowing boat, and a few cherished belongings. But the constant, in grave after grave, was preservation. The ship was not destroyed. It was transformed, from a vessel into a tomb, from a thing that moved across water into a thing that would hold its place in the landscape for 1,000 years. So where does the burning come from? Mostly from words rather than earth, from the Icelandic sagas written down generations later, and from foreign eyewitnesses like Ibn Fadlan, whose Rus' funeral did indeed end in fire. And even that famous account is complicated. Some scholars suspect the burning structure he saw may have been partly symbolic, a stage built in the shape of a ship rather than a seagoing vessel sacrificed whole. Ship burnings likely did happen here and there, in places where raising a mound was impractical or where fire carried a particular meaning. But actual burned ship remains are vanishingly rare in the ground, which is a polite way of saying that archaeologists have spent lifetimes looking for the famous flaming longship and have mostly found hills. And yet perhaps the idea of the burning ship mattered as much as any real one ever did. Fire was sacred in the Norse world. It purified. It transformed. A flaming ship was not just a spectacle. It was an engine of passage, carrying the soul upward through smoke, the way a hull carries a body through water. But burial had its own quiet advantages. A mound endured. It gave the living something to return to, a green shoulder of earth on the skyline, a place where a name could be spoken aloud year after year. In a society where honor, lineage and story were the true currency, a monument you could stand on was worth a great deal. So which farewell was real? Both were. But the buried ships left behind the bones of history, timber and treasure for archaeologists to read like a book, while the burning ones left only legend and smoke. Now, it would be easy to assume that all this ceremony belonged to men, that Norse women waited at home by the loom while their husbands sailed off into legend. The graves say otherwise. Weaving, it should be said, was itself skilled and respected work in that world, but women's lives were never confined to it, and neither were their deaths. Some of the grandest ship burials ever found belong to women, and at least one of them outshines nearly every king. That one is Oseberg. When the mound was opened in 1904, it revealed the most beautiful Viking ship ever recovered. Sweeping curves, a prow carved into coiling serpents and spirals, craftsmanship fit for royalty, and inside it, not a warrior king, but two women. One was older, one younger, and their identities remain one of archaeology's most pleasant unsolved puzzles. Perhaps the elder was a queen. Perhaps. And many scholars lean this way. She was a vulva, a seeress, a practitioner of the ritual craft the Norse called cedar, someone believed to walk the line between the worlds and glimpse what was coming. Among the grave goods were objects that looked very much like ritual staffs and wands, along with animal remains that hint at ceremony. If she was indeed a seeress, then Oseberg honoured not military power but spiritual authority. And in the Norse world, the person who could read fate carried at least as much weight as the person who carried a sword. And then there is the sheer wealth of the grave. Sledges and a ceremonial cart, all richly carved, tapestries and imported silks, beds and chests and kitchen gear, animals in numbers. These two women were sent off not as passengers but as rulers, equipped as though they were expected to go on ruling on the far side. Other graves across Scandinavia repeat the pattern. Near Stavanger in Norway, the burial known as the Gorsel Queens held gold jewellery, fine bronze vessels carried in from Ireland, and riding gear of the highest quality, a grave that radiated status in every direction. The Latby ship in Denmark shows the marks of an elite resting place as well, and at Birka in Sweden, A famous grave long assumed to hold a male warrior, buried with a full set of weapons and 2 horses, was revealed by DNA analysis to hold a biologically female skeleton. Scholars still debate what that means about her life, as scholars happily will. But the simplest reading is also the boldest. In the Viking Age, women could hold power, and they could take it with them. They were not passengers in the great shit graves. Sometimes they were the whole voyage. Whoever lay at the centre, no one sailed empty-handed. A ship burial was packed like a time capsule, a curated collection of everything the dead might need, want, or simply deserve on the other side. And the inventory tells us as much about Viking life as it does about Viking death. Weapons came first, at least in the graves of the elite. Swords with decorated hilts, spears, shields, axes. Not necessarily because the afterlife was imagined as one long battle, but because a sword was a statement of rank, the way a crown or a signet ring might be elsewhere. In some graves, the blades were found deliberately bent or folded, and archaeologists believe this was done with great respect rather than none at all. The weapon was ritually retired, allowed to die, so that it too could follow its owner across. But alongside the weapons sat the gentle, ordinary things, and these may be the most touching cargo of all. Combs, cooking pots, whetstones for keeping an edge keen, buckets, ladles, chests of folded cloth, and board games. The Norse strategy game called Nefertafel turns up in graves complete with carved playing pieces, which suggests that eternity was expected to include, among its grander occupations, the occasional quiet evening. The dead might feast in the halls of the gods, but apparently they would also want to comb their hair and have something to do with their hands. Then there were the animals, in remarkable numbers. The Gokstad ship, it is worth remembering, was a true ocean-goer. A faithful replica of it crossed the Atlantic under sail in 1893, riding the swells beautifully, and its burial was provisioned on the same generous scale. Those birds had travelled thousands of miles along the trade routes before ever reaching a fjord, and their presence in the mound says 2 things at once: that Viking commerce reached astonishingly far, and that the man in that grave had no intention of being upstaged by anyone in this world, or that one mound held the remains of 12 horses, 8 dogs, and, wonderfully, 2 peacocks. Peacocks in Norway in the 9th century. Next. And in certain graves, as we have already seen, the most sobering cargo was human. Enslaved people whose presence shows how completely that world believed the bonds of duty continued past the grave. They too are part of this story, and they are remembered with the dignity the ceremony itself did not always grant them. Everything in these shits was chosen, nothing was filler. Each object was a sentence in a final biography. This one was a warrior. This one loved fine cloth. This one had wealth. That one had power. Written in gold, iron and bone, and then sealed quietly beneath the turf. And though the fjords of Norway hold the most famous examples, the practice travelled everywhere the Norse did, changing shape to fit each landscape the way water fits a harbour. In Norway itself, the emphasis was monumental, whole ships under great mounds, raised where they could be seen, from the water, from the valley floor, from a neighbouring farm 2 generations later. The dense blue clay of the Oslofjord region preserved timber astonishingly well, which is the only reason Oseberg and Gokstad survived to be found at all. Display was the point. The mound was less about hiding the dead than about showing the living exactly where power had rested. In Sweden, at ancient grave fields like Vendel and Valskerda, the custom wore a different coat. Ships were sometimes buried whole there too. Generation after generation of chieftains laid in their vessels in the same quiet meadow, a dynasty keeping its appointments for centuries. But across much of the country, mourners instead raise stone ship settings, the outline of a vessel drawn on the land in standing stones, prow and stern marked by taller pillars, often enclosing a cremation, the ashes resting within a ship made of nothing but shape and suggestion. Some of these stone ships still ride the fields of southern Sweden today, grey and patient in the long northern light, their prows pointed forever toward a sea they will never reach. Fire and stone together, the same idea, spelled in a different alphabet. Along the river roads of the east, through what is now Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, the Rus carried the custom with them, and it was on the banks of the Volga that Ibn Fadlan watched his chieftain's fiery send-off. Full ship burials are rarer in the eastern soil, but boat-shaped mounds and familiar grave goods echo the same core convictions: a journey, a threshold, a spectacle worth remembering. In Denmark, the wet and marshy ground was unkind to buried wood, so fewer ships survive, Ladby being the precious exception, yet stone settings and seafaring symbols in elite graves show that the idea was thoroughly at home there as well. And farther out along the sea lanes, in Scotland, in Ireland, and around the shores of the Baltic, boat graves appear on headlands and island beaches. Sometimes a real hull settled into the sand with its cargo, sometimes only an outline of stones where a hull was imagined. Wherever the Norse went, the ship went into the ground with them. The details bent to local soil and local custom, but the message never changed. In that world, no one simply walked into the afterlife. One sailed there, out past the islands, out past the last of the light, with a good hull underneath, and provisions enough for a long crossing. For the Vikings, death was not an ending at all, it was a departure. And on quiet ridgelines above the fjords, the green mounds still sit like ships riding at anchor, waiting, very patiently, for a tide that is in no particular hurry to come in. And this, in the end, is what gives the ship burials their strange, lasting power. They were never simply lavish funerals. They grew from a conviction woven through the whole of Norse belief that death was not a stopping point, but a departure, and that a soul setting out on such a journey would need a vessel to carry it. It helps to remember how thoroughly water shaped the northern imagination. In Norse cosmology, the inhabited world, Midgard, was ringed by a vast encircling ocean, and the realms beyond were divided from one another by cold, wide rivers. Life, trade, news, wealth and danger all arrived by sea, so it seemed only natural that death would leave by sea as well. There was Naglfar, a grim vessel said to be built from the untrimmed nails of the dead, fated to slip its moorings at the end of the world and carry chaos toward the gods, a story that gave the Norse a practical reason to keep their dead well groomed, since every neglected fingernail was a small. The ship was the answer to every distance in that world, and the distance between the living and the dead was simply one more crossing. The myths are full of ships, and not ordinary ones. Plank in that terrible ship. And there was Skidbladnir, made by dwarven craftsmen for the god Freyja, a ship that always found a fair wind and could be folded, so the stories say, until it fit inside a pouch. These tales were the backdrop against which real funerals took place. When a community hauled a longship ashore and lowered it into a trench, they were echoing the legends, translating myth into timber and earth. To be buried in a ship, then, was to be going somewhere. Where exactly depended on the life you had lived. There was Valhalla, the great hall where chosen warriors feasted until the end of days. There was Folkvanga, the meadow of the goddess Freyja, who by some tellings received half of the honoured dead herself, a detail the poets never quite explained. And for those whose deaths were quiet and unremarkable, there was the misty realm of hell, ruled by a goddess of the same name, a place less of punishment than of stillness, a long grey afternoon that never quite becomes evening. Wherever the road led, the point was the same. The dead did not walk it, they sailed. And this belief was never reserved for kings. Ordinary people, whose families could not spare a real vessel, were laid in graves outlined with stones set in the shape of a hull, a ship drawn on the ground in rock. Some cremations were carried out inside these stone outlines, so that even the humblest farmer departed in a boat of a kind. Everyone, in the end, was a traveller. The only question was the size of the craft. Seen this way, the great ship funerals stop looking like extravagance and start looking like careful preparation. The weapons, the tapestries, the sledges and cauldrons, these were not decorations for a tomb, they were provisions for a voyage. The mourners were not sealing someone away, they were seeing someone off. And when the mound closed over the mast, the living walked home believing not that a life had ended, but that a journey had changed course, over a horizon no watcher could follow. 1,000 years have passed since the last of those ships settled into the earth, and yet they have never been more alive. The Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, the Tune ship, all three now rest in Norway, in high quiet halls built for them, where the light falls softly on curved oak, and visitors speak, without quite knowing why, in lowered voices. People cross the world to stand beneath those prows and study the carving, the sweep of the hull, the sheer nerve of a culture that looked at its finest piece of engineering and decided it belonged in a grave. The scholars who study them keep finding new cargo. The timber itself is a document. The growth rings in the oak can be read almost like a diary, revealing the summers that were kind to the trees and the summers that were not, and even the rough year the ship was built, placing the Oseberg burial in the early 9th century. The construction tells of shipwrights working without drawings or formulas, shaping planks by eye and inherited instinct, arriving at hulls so light and strong that modern engineers study them with respect. And the goods placed aboard map a world far larger than Scandinavia, silk that began its life in the East, coins struck in distant mints, dyes and beads, and fine metalwork that passed through many hands before coming to rest in a Norwegian mound. The Vikings we meet in these graves are not raiders on a lonely edge of the map. They are participants in a web of trade that stretched thread by thread across most of the known world. The ships sail on in imagination as well. Filmmakers and novelists return to the burial mound again and again, not always accurately but always reverently, because the image is too good to leave alone. Death as a voyage, the vessel as a promise. Some modern Scandinavians still ask for their ashes to be scattered on the water, a gentle descendant of the old rite. And a few patient archaeologists have built replicas and taken them out onto rivers and fjords, partly to test the engineering, and partly, one suspects, just to feel that shape of hull meet that northern water. A ship burial, in the end, was a performance, the last act of a life spent in trade and war and poetry and ambition. And the performance has never really closed. The ships are still on stage, still insisting, in their silent wooden way, that some vessels never truly stop moving. They only find new seas. And now we change course and sail south. Away from the fjords and the grave mounds, down past the coasts Harold's dragon ships once knew, to a warmer country, to the river valleys of southern France, where, in the century after Stamford Bridge, the nobility of Europe invented a new kind of devotion. Not devotion to a god or a king this time, but to a lady glimpsed across a crowded hall. They called it love. Whether it truly was love is a question we can turn over slowly, like a smooth stone, for the rest of tonight. Courtly love, as the 12th century understood it, had almost nothing to do with marriage. Marriage handled households, heirs, and alliances briskly and unsentimentally. Courtly love lived in a different room of the castle altogether. It was about longing, about wanting what you could not have, discovering that the wanting itself could be sweet, and refining that sweetness into an art. By the middle of the century it was so fashionable among the nobility that it acquired an unwritten rule book, part etiquette manual, part philosophy seminar, part elaborate parlour game, and almost entirely detached from real life. The game was born in the courts of southern France, above all in Aquitaine, and it worked like this. A knight or young nobleman would devote himself to a lady, usually of higher rank than his own, and very often already married, which placed her permanently out of reach. That unreachability was not an obstacle to the game, it was the whole point. The knight's task was not to win the lady but to honour her, to compose verses in her praise, to perform brave deeds in her name, to grow pale and thoughtful at feasts, and to suffer, beautifully and at length, in dignified silence. If this sounds like heartbreak worn as formal dress, it was. The rules, though unwritten, were understood by everyone. The love must be secret, or at least conducted as though it were secret, in a court where everyone knew. It must be difficult, because ease would cheapen it. And it must remain forever unfulfilled, for the moment the longing was satisfied, the spell was considered broken. Suffering, in this system, was not a side effect. Suffering was the currency. A night's sleepless composing was proof of his sincerity. His hopelessness was the measure of his nobility. The more impossible the love, the finer the lover. All of this braided itself neatly into chivalry, the knightly code of honour and service that was maturing at the same time. The perfect knight, the poets said, was fierce in the field and meek before his lady, and each quality proved the other. Love was not a distraction from knighthood. It was knighthood's final examination. A man who could endure years of elegant heartbreak without once compromising his honour had passed a test that no tournament could set. And yes, there was a gentle absurdity running underneath it all. While the knight polished his verses about his lady's grace, her marriage to some substantial nobleman carried on undisturbed, dinners and ledgers and all. The ideal preached restraint and lofty virtue, while the real courts of Europe produced their usual steady supply of intrigue and wounded pride. But none of that slowed the fashion down. Poets and singers built entire careers on tales of knights who ached nobly and ladies who wept becomingly, and the fantasy proved far more durable than the facts. Love, which had always been an emotion, was becoming something new. It was becoming a code. The men who wrote that code, verse by verse, were the troubadours, wandering poet-musicians who turned unrequited longing into a professional discipline, one lute string and one melancholy stanza at a time. These were not ragged minstrels singing for coins at the roadside. Many were noblemen themselves, educated, multilingual, entirely at home in the great houses, and the very first of them, as it happens, was a Duke of Aquitaine, the grandfather of Eleanor herself. They knew the courts from the inside, and they knew precisely how delicious and how delicate it was to stand in a lord's hall and sing, with great tenderness, about that same lord's wife. The movement began in Occitania, the warm southern sweep of what is now France, in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, and its songs were composed in Occitan, a soft Romance tongue that seemed made for this kind of music. The subject rarely varied, love that could not be had. A knight kneeling, in his heart, before a distant noblewoman. It was misery, but misery arranged as carefully as a garden. And the setting mattered. Troubadour songs were not tavern entertainment. They were performed in castle halls by firelight, before lords and ladies who heard their own concealed feelings set to melody and pretended, with varying success, not to blush. A competent troubadour could flatter a countess. A great one, it was said, could start with a single well-placed metaphor, a whispered scandal that outlived everyone in the room. Out of all this singing came a refined vocabulary. Finamore, the troubadours called it, refined love, built not on desire but on admiration, humility, patience, and a kind of cherished inner ache. The lady stood near divine and untouchable. The lover proved his worth through service and song. Some of these poets were entirely real. There was Joffre Rudel, who, it is said, fell hopelessly in love with a countess far across the sea on the strength of travellers' descriptions alone. Love from afar, he called it, and he sang of little else. There was Bernard de Ventadorn, perhaps the finest melodist of them all, who turned his own disappointments into songs so lovely that they were copied and kept for 800 years. And behind many of them stood Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, granddaughter of that first troubadour duke, patron of poets, a woman who did not merely sponsor this culture, but very likely shaped it, and who, some accounts suggest, lived a chapter or two of it besides. What the troubadours started did not stay in the south. Their manner spread north through France, east to the courts of Germany, down into Italy, where it was refined into the sweet new style that fed Dante, and across the water into England. They invented more than a style of song. They invented the idea that expressing love through art was itself a noble act, that a well-made verse was a form of virtue. They did not simply perform for the court. Patiently, evening by evening, they taught the court how to love. At the centre of every song stood the lady, muse, judge, sovereign and prize, all at once. She was praised in terms that left the actual woman almost invisible, skin like ivory, eyes like stars, hair like spun gold, the same shining inventory repeated from song to song until the ladies must have wondered whether the poets could tell any of them apart. She was less a person than a living emblem, meant to inspire devotion and refine the men who felt it. For the men, this arrangement was rather generous. It gave a warrior culture a respectable license for tenderness. A knight could sigh, weep, and write poetry without injury to his reputation because his feeling was classed as sacred. For the women, the bargain was thinner. A lady was expected to inspire love endlessly, while never once acting on it, to remain gracious and composed while being watched, praised, and pursued by earnest young men armed with ballads. In some tales she wields real authority, setting her knight impossible tasks and ruling on questions of the heart like a judge. But that authority was mostly ceremonial. Outside the songs, noble daughters were married early for land and alliance, and their preferences were rarely the deciding vote. And yet, and this is the quiet, redeeming corner of the whole institution, courtly love gave medieval women something genuinely rare, the centre of the story. In an age when nearly every recorded voice was male, the songs placed a woman at the heart of the narrative, made her judgment the measure of a man and her favour the plot of the poem. Some women took that opening and used it well. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie of Champagne were not passive muses but active patrons, commissioning romances, sheltering poets, and steering the whole literature toward their own ideals and, now and then, their own politics. The pedestal was confining, no question. But a few remarkable women discovered that if you must stand on a pedestal, you can at least use the height. Meanwhile, chivalry itself, which had begun as a soldier's practical code, loyalty to one's lord, courage in the field, mercy to the defeated, was acquiring a silk lining. The courtly knight now served a threefold hierarchy of devotion. God first, his feudal lord second, served in war and peace, and his lady third, the invisible star by which every gesture was quietly steered. Where an older warrior had carried a battle standard, the courtly knight tied a lady's token about his arm, a ribbon, a veil, a detached sleeve, a small soft flag announcing that his lance carried, alongside its public duties, a private dedication. In time, manuals appeared to govern the art, most famously one composed in the orbit of Marie of Champagne, instructing the true lover to be humble, courteous, and discreet, to guard his lady's good name more carefully than his own life, and, strangest of all, to rejoice in his service even if it. Tournaments turned into theatre, the lists hung with banners, every rider's favour known, every victory read as proof of a lover's worth, and chroniclers noting knights who rode themselves to exhaustion rather than withdraw and appear less devoted than a rival, was never rewarded. The ache, the manuals agreed, was the proof. And yet beneath all that velvet lay the old iron world, patiently waiting, castles that needed garrisons, roads that needed guarding, and distant wars that would, soon enough, call the sighing knights away from the firelit hall and back into their armour. There is a small puzzle sitting at the heart of all this, and medieval people saw it just as clearly as we do. The same hand that spent the evening shaping a rondo, weighing one soft syllable against another by candlelight, had spent that morning in the practice yard, learning to swing a length of sharpened steel. The knight was two creatures wearing one surcoat, a soldier trained for the worst days of his century, and a poet auditioning for its gentlest. Commentators at the time noticed the contradiction and, being medieval, they decided the contradiction was the point. A gentle man is merely gentle after all, but a dangerous man who chooses gentleness, who bows and lowers his voice, has performed a small domestic miracle. The wider the gap between what he could do and what he chose to do, the nobler he was reckoned. Ferocity kneeling to courtesy, that was the picture. And for an aristocracy raised on border wars and married off by treaty, often to strangers met the day before the wedding, that picture was very nearly irresistible. Fight hard, love harder, and do the loving, please, from a respectful and preferably rhyming distance. Of course, every code invites a breach, and a code built entirely out of secrecy and longing was less a code than a standing invitation. Beneath the airy verses and the tournament pageantry sat real hearts, which have never once in recorded history followed instructions. When the fantasy stepped down off the parchment, it produced some of the most famous scandals of the age. Consider Peter Abelard and Heloise, the most celebrated cautionary tale the 12th century ever told about itself. Abelard was the star philosopher of Paris, a man so dazzling in debate that students crossed Europe on foot to sit on the floor at his lectures. Heloise was his pupil, and by every account one of the most learned people of her generation, famous for her Latin in her own right. The lessons became conversations, the conversations became poems, and the poems became an attachment that was entirely real and, before long, entirely public. There was a secret marriage, there was a furious family, there was a retaliation harsh enough to shock even that unshockable century, and we will leave it there. What matters is where the story finally settles, both of them, in the end, in religious houses, apart, spending the rest of their lives writing to each other. And what letters they are. Theology and tenderness braided together, argument and ache sharing the same sentence, two of the finest minds in Europe conducting a marriage of paper across a distance that never closed. The courtly ideal had promised that love would ennoble. Life, as usual, edited the promise. What survived the editing was the writing, which is still read, 8 centuries on, by people who have forgotten every king of that era. High politics fared no better. Eleanor of Aquitaine, patroness of troubadours and the woman around whom half of this culture quietly orbits, went east on the Second Crusade with her first husband, Louis of France, a man of prayer married to a woman of poetry. At Antioch she lingered in long conversation with her uncle Raymond, a charming and cultivated host, and tongues began to move. Most historians doubt there was anything to it beyond politics and personality, but rumour does not require evidence, only appetite. The whisperings soured an already unhappy royal marriage. The marriage was in time annulled, and Eleanor rode away with her vast lands and promptly married young Henry Plantagenet, at which point roughly half of France changed management overnight. Whether or not there was ever a love story at Antioch, the rumour of one helped redraw the map of Europe, which is more than most armies ever manage. Even royal daughters were not sheltered from this weather. In the year 1314, Paris was consumed by what became known as the affair of the Tour de Nesle, in which 3 young princesses of France were accused, on servants' gossip and a pair of embroidered purses given as gifts, of holding secret meetings in an old tower above the Seine. What followed fell on everyone like a hard winter. 2 royal marriages were annulled. The ladies disappeared into convents and fortress rooms for years. The men accused alongside them met the full, unforgiving machinery of medieval justice, and those details we will gently decline. The lesson the court drew was chilling in its simplicity. The poems praised distant adoration in every stanza, and the law stood waiting with iron the moment adoration came close. Beneath the famous scandals ran quieter ones that never earned a chronicle of their own. A lady sent away to a remote castle because a letter was found. A knight dispatched on pilgrimage as penance for a suspicion nobody could prove. Abbots preaching that a wandering heart was like a rusted sword of no use to God or man. The church courts never outlawed courtly love by name, but they issued a steady drizzle of small fines for what the records call inordinate familiarity. The same society that applauded a knight's sighing expected the sighing to remain sighing. Beginning in the later 12th century, authors like Chrétien de Troyes, working at the court of Marie de Champagne, Eleanor's own daughter, who seems to have kept the family business running, took all that raw longing and secrecy and forged it into long narrative poems in which love was not a. When it became anything more, the applause stopped remarkably fast. If the troubadours wrote the songs of courtly love, the romance writers built its great stage sets. Subplot, but the engine of the whole machine. Their favourite laboratory was the court of King Arthur, a fictional kingdom where every dilemma of the code could be tested at full scale. In Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Chrétien assembled the ultimate courtly triangle: Queen Guinevere, serene and unreachable, King Arthur, her duty-bound husband, and Lancelot, the most perfect knight alive, helplessly devoted to the one woman he can never openly claim. Lancelot crawls across a bridge made of a single sword blade, bare hands on the steel, dark water moving underneath. And none of it, Chrétien makes quietly clear, is as hard as the ache he carries, which no armour fits over. The tale had everything the code required: secret meetings, symbolic tokens, the constant soft threat of ruin. Audiences adored it. Every young knight in Europe wanted to be Lancelot, though, presumably with some revisions to the ending. In the centuries that followed came the vast prose cycles, whole shelves of interlocking Arthurian story, until at last, in the 15th century, Sir Thomas Malory, writing, it is said, from a prison cell, gathered everything into Le Morte d'Arthur and sealed the legend into the canon of the West. From France, the fashion spread like warmth moving through a cold house. In Germany, Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote Parzival, in which a young knight's slow spiritual ripening is inseparable from his faithfulness in love. Around the year 1230, a poet named Guillaume de Loris began the Romance of the Rose, a dream vision in which the beloved is a rosebud locked inside a walled garden, and all the courtly virtues stroll about in human form, courtesy and pity and fair. Welcome drifting across the lawns like guests at Anne. Love as glory and love as undoing bound together so tightly that no one since has managed to pry them apart. Not all of it wore armour. Endless garden party. Guillaume died with the dream unfinished, and some 40 years later, Jean de Meurne picked up the pen and continued it at enormous length, adding sharp satire that teased clerics, nobles, and the love code itself. The result became the nearest thing the Middle Ages had to a runaway bestseller, copied into hundreds of manuscripts and argued over in university halls. Was it a handbook of devotion or an elaborate joke at devotion's expense? The safest scholarly answer appears to be yes. Either way, these books standardized the vocabulary of yearning. Love as service, the beloved as light, jealousy as a dungeon. The metaphors became conventions precisely because everyone borrowed them. Real courts even used the romances as etiquette manuals: how to bow, how to compliment, how to despair correctly. All this perfume did not drift past heaven unnoticed. To the bishops, a culture that dressed admiration for someone else's spouse in the language of worship sat very awkwardly beside Christian teaching on fidelity and humility, and by the early 13th century the preachers went to work. Jacques de Vitry salted his sermons with cautionary tales of knights who rode to tournaments wearing a lady's ribbon and rode home, as he saw it, with their souls in arrears. The Dominican Stephen of Bourbon called the singers peddlers of vanity. Moralists coined a tidy label, disordered love, to wall off proper marital affection from the poetic fever sweeping the halls. The penances had a certain poetry of their own. A knight caught exchanging tokens in Lent might be sent on pilgrimage barefoot, or ordered to pay for church candles, a literal fee for a figurative fire. Confessors' manuals advised priests to ask, gravely, about suspicious exchanges of verse. Daydreaming itself became a taxable activity, payable in prayers. And yet the crackdown kept tripping over one awkward fact: the greatest patrons of love poetry, Eleanor, her daughter Marie, Blanche of Castile, were also the greatest patrons of monasteries and cathedrals. Andreas Capellanus, a chaplain said to have written at Marie's request, produced a treatise called On Love, laying out 31 rules of the game: that love and marriage are strangers, that a true lover eats and sleeps very little, and then, in the final chapter, advised the reader to renounce. A bishop might thunder against the songs on Sunday and dine with a poetry-loving queen on Tuesday, and the dinner usually won. So the condemnations stayed mostly rhetorical, and some clerics tried cleverness instead. The entire system as folly. Whether it is a manual with a disclaimer or a satire with a very long setup, nobody has ever quite decided. But for all the sermons and all the satire, courtly love survived, for the simplest of reasons. It offered what sermons rarely do: drama. The Church managed to trim the excesses. It never managed to remove the desire to desire. By the middle of the 14th century, though, The gilding had begun to flake on its own. Wars dragged on. Plague emptied towns. New money blurred the old tidy ranks, and knights increasingly hired themselves out as plain professional soldiers. After the Black Death, Europe's mood tilted from silk towards survival, and sighing beneath a window came to seem like a luxury imported from somebody else's century. Yet the old language did not die. It changed its clothes. It became courtesy. In 1528, Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier repackaged the chivalric postures for Renaissance palaces. Instead of pining under a lady's window, the polished courtier practiced sprezzatura, effortless grace, dancing well, jesting lightly, admiring from behind a veil of wit. Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Chryse, written around 1385, gives us a hero who worships by the book, while war and politics quietly dismantle the fantasy around him. And in the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer teases knights whose fine talk outruns their conduct, a sure sign that audiences now enjoyed. The yearning remained. The desperation went out of fashion. Love was still a game. The rules had simply exchanged chainmail for velvet. Literature registered the shift like a barometer. The parody as much as the ideal. Then the printing press flung the doors open. Where hand-copied romances had circulated among the wealthy, cheap-printed ballads carried the old ache out to merchants, artisans and apprentices, compact, hummable tragedies of faithful maids and stubborn knights. The talk of love became common property, less refined, more democratic, and considerably funnier. Meanwhile, the playful courts of love, those mock tribunals where ladies sat in judgment over lovers' quarrels, faded away as kings grew wary of aristocrats gathering for any purpose whatsoever. Monarchs preferred loyalty oaths to love oaths. But traces lingered everywhere. Tournaments still awarded ladies favours. Young nobles still learned the lute for balcony purposes. Heraldry manuals still permitted a flaming heart on a shield for a maiden's honour. And in the 15th century the first Valentine poems appear in the written record, already fluent in the old dialect of service, secrecy, and sweet pain, which is to say that courtly love never really ended. It only kept changing its wardrobe. Petrarch glimpsed a woman called Laura in a church in Avignon and addressed sonnets to her for decades. The unreachable lady relocated to Italy. Shakespeare took the old triangle apart and gave Juliet a voice as strong as Romeo's, something the troubadours never quite thought of. Jane Austen's heroines rolled their eyes at knights in armour. And yet Darcy's long silent devotion across candle-lit rooms is Lancelot in a tailored coat, tempered by accountability and mutual respect. Byron would have done perfectly well reciting in a 12th century hall. The Victorians armoured courtesy all over again, with calling cards, chaperone dances, and the language of flowers, tokens that signified everything while saying nothing, which is the courtly trick exactly. And when castles gave way to cinemas, the pageant simply moved indoors, the long look, the letter, the kiss postponed to the final reel. Every love story that keeps its lovers apart for 90 minutes is running the oldest rule in the Troubadour Handbook, the one that says anticipation is sweeter than arrival. Even now, people write devotedly to admired figures they will never meet, and the shape of it, the exalted beloved, the distant admirer, the token, the code, would be recognized in a heartbeat by any viscount of the 12th century. We say we want realistic love. The evidence suggests we also want the quest, the rules, and the secret sign. We always have. And that seems the gentlest place to set all of this down for the night. We have travelled a long way this evening. We began on the banks of the Nile, with a king who wore the sunrise on his shoulders and was never once allowed a day off, who tasted his food last, married for theology, and spent his spare decades quietly building the room he would rest in. We sailed north into colder water with Harold, who left home a wounded boy of 15, stood guard over emperors in Constantinople, came home rich as a legend, and ended his story in an English autumn in 1066, closing an entire age behind him like a heavy door. And we have finished here, in candlelit halls, where love was a song sung at a careful distance, and the bravest men in Europe could be undone by a raised eyebrow. 3 worlds, and one quiet thing in common: they were all only people. The Pharaoh worried about the river. The Sea King grew homesick under southern stars. The poet counted syllables and hoped. Their empires are museum glass now. Their ships are shadows of timber in grassy mounds. Their songs survive in a few hundred patient manuscripts. And yet here we are, thinking of them at the very end of a day, which is its own small afterlife, and perhaps the one they would have liked best. The Nile still slides past the old temples in the dark. The northern seas still fold and unfold under the wind, patient as ever. And somewhere tonight, someone is choosing their words very carefully for a letter they may never send. History does not really end, it only lowers its voice. Everything that needed doing today has been done, and everything else can wait for morning. The Pharaohs kept the sun rising for 3,000 years, after all. It will manage on its own until tomorrow. Good night.